Welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. We're continuing our conversation this week about the Russian interference and involvement in Africa and the Middle East. And you recall that last time we were talking about their information operations, which really enables you to unpack how this all plugs in to the various levels of their activity and how it all works together. And we're using Libya as a case study to illustrate that. So coming back to that situation, by March 2019, you have basically that information growing to 12 Facebook groups, including a pro-Haftar. You remember he was the dictator running eastern Libya that Russia had decided to put all of its cards on behind and back, and pro-Saif and highly localized news sites that boasted audiences of over 250,000 and had a weekly penetration of up to 2 million users. So that meant Russian narratives were really getting this wide dissemination across just under a third of the Libyan population of 6.5 million. So during that same month, in March 2019, a Prigozhin-linked firm, you'll remember Prigozhin was the person who founded the Wagner group and operating it and controlling it at this point in time before his death at the hands of the Russians. But he had purchased a firm which was linked to these operations, and he had a 50% stake in the former state-run pro-Gaddafi Al-Jamahiriya TV station. So he's moved out now from these social media platforms. He's now linking that to the ability to also plug into legacy media and mainstream platforms. So at the same time, he also created a pro-Eastern Libyan Haftar newspaper. Pro-LAAF was the organization that Haftar was running, and he officially consulted with the pro-Haftar and Al-Haddad news organization through that. And one key theme was that the UN is failing in its goals for Libya, etc., and then starting to target all these institutions, which normally a lot of these developing nations people would be tending to rely on or trust, or you're receiving medical aid from, or medical aid from the West, where you then start claiming don't trust this medical aid, etc. So then you've got newspaper, TV, social media, really getting a stranglehold on all forms of information in Libya. And then in May of the same year, 2019, you had 3 operatives who were linked to a Wagner-linked troll factory that were arrested in Tripoli, accused of electioneering on behalf of Saif, this organization. But by then, Haftar had begun a full assault on Tripoli in any event, anyway, military assault. And Libya's second post-uprising civil war began, and this would disrupt the very UN process that was supposed to lead to the elections that Russia aimed to engineer in Saif's favor. This is the really complex dynamics that were at work there, but you can see the mobilization of their information operations behind their objectives and behind Saif and Haftar and the LAAF. So where are we today in 2025 in relation to Libya? It's really become the operational hub of Russia's Africa cluster. You've got military bases that this Africa Corps, the former Wagner group, now has commandeered in Tobruk, Al-Qadim, which are otherwise known as Benghazi, previous times, Gaba Dabia, Jufra, Brak el-Shati, all of these locations now, military bases and aerodromes that have become part of that Africa Corps Russian universe and galaxy of assets in Libya's southwest. And then you have the newly developed Martin al-Sara near the border with Chad. Branching down to plug into those other sites where Russian interests need a steady, stable, secure supply chain to get stuff to the ports for their further on sail on pushing in terms of dispersing and making a fortune out of those African assets that we mentioned last time, their timber, their gold, their diamonds, etc., and their oil. So this is all part, these air bases that he's taken over, Putin and his Africa Corps, they're part of an air bridge that helped arm the attempted push by Sudan's Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, in April of 2023. and to sustain this devastating civil war that has been really continuing to be waged ever since 2023, which has created massive human life loss, equating to a genocide, and also the huge devastation across the infrastructure of Sudan. So the troop movements and flights over 2024 indicated that Russia's bases in Libya have become indispensable in maintaining its deployments in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, as well as its prolonged presence in the Central African Republic. So you can see how critical Libya is in this respect, but it's also an important link, as mentioned, in the smuggling of their pillaged goods. It's also become a vehicle for their exploitation of people smuggling. So we've mentioned before how that disrupted environment has enabled a lot of people smuggling flow into Europe, which is why France, Germany, the UK were all interested in trying to choke that off and had become involved in trying to resolve the Libya situation. But Russia, seeing this, actually adopted it as another pressure point to apply to the West. So they were actually actively facilitating people smuggling efforts to get refugees and people seeking better economic situations into Europe, and helping through the use of airlines in Syria, and even moving people through Syria to get into Europe, and put pressure on the West that way in relation to their support for Ukraine in that war. And so showing Europe, you're going to pay a price on so many different fronts. And at the same time, they're earning money from these people smuggling operations too. And of course, then there's been the oil smuggling regime that they've put in place. And at the moment, they're earning about, or they're basically exploiting 40% of Libyan oil and earning a fortune from that exploitation. So this is the scale and the dimension of the exploitation that's been going on. And effectively, the large deployment that they've invested in Libya, it's not only been basically a free hit for them. It hasn't really cost them anything, because anything they're doing there pays for itself. But certainly the profit, the return on that investment has been enormous, and really helped Russia to evade sanctions regimes. And creating and exploiting these lawless environments and supercharging, smuggling and people smuggling has been, how they operate. They love those environments. They love exploiting them, and they like to create them to exploit them. And so, when they get behind one of these dictators and coup operators, they effectively also create dependence on Russia of those individuals. There's a financial interest for them, but also they depend so much on Russian security to stay in the saddle. And now we've seen a situation in Libya where their central bank is really funding direct resources and finances through to Russia to really support all of their operations. So they've now got a stranglehold on the Libyan central bank as well. And you can see how they can use that asset in their endeavours. So that's the Libyan story, so important to tease out just on its own. But in Niger, President Mohamed Bazoum of Niger was displaced by a Russian effectively supported coup in 2023. Bazoum was a democratically elected leader who had support of the West in terms of aid and development. So he was displaced. And then Russia played on a lot of public discontent, again, through this information warfare techniques that we saw applied in Libya, and the various levels of that, and effectively really building on a certain levels of paranoia and protecting the interests of the military junta. So effectively, Europe's resources would have been well spent during all of these threats and challenges that were evolving in strengthening the information space. This is where it all starts, where it comes back to themes we've pursued before about information warfare. But Europe, basically left this field completely open to the Russians to exploit. So what Europe could have done is expand the presence of news institutions into new forms of media and producing a stream of reliable, consistent content that would have preemptively filled that void. And one of the ways these rectangular rat bags exploit that environment is through the infiltration of their own legacy media outlets, so Press TV, Hispan TV, as we mentioned from Iran previously, and RTV in Russia, Xinhua, etc., and other mechanisms from China. They come in with polished, well-produced product, but at a vastly cheaper price point than Western media will charge. So this is why another factor in why developing countries are quite happy to enable and allow those vehicles and those agencies to come in. That's the story of Africa, and you can see the spread of that Russian influence across Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Libya, and how critical all of that is to the position they occupy, both in a geopolitical and a resources sense, particularly if you have military bases and port facilities in Sudan and Libya. So let's now move to the Middle East as intertwined with and complementary to that and related to each other. So Russian involvement in Syria really goes back a long way, right back to the Soviet Cold War days, when they were busy arming and partnering with Middle East countries, particularly in their aggressive wars against Israel. And so that long-standing situation in Syria allowed Russia to develop access to really critical strategic assets, such as the ports and airports that exist there in nice warm water locations and proximate to areas of interest that Russia was developed, and now even further into mutually supporting African interests. And of course, it enables them to influence issues in the Middle East, and it enables them to expand their investment in infrastructure and resource exploitation too. So that resource exploitation, really, we've talked about Gazprom, and primarily that's where this is centered on oil and gas. And you've obviously got the center of the world's oil and gas production in the Middle East, a vastly lucrative industry worth well over $4.3 trillion. Still today, if I asked someone what's the most profitable company in the world, I'm sure the answer to that would generally be, oh, it's Microsoft, or it's Google, or it's Apple, or whatever. But in fact, still today, the world's most profitable company is Saudi Aramco, with $240 billion annually of clear net profit. So you can see the incentive there for Russia, and it particularly gets amplified by the lack of expertise, the lack of a skilled workforce, and the lack of maintenance capabilities that exist in areas like the Middle East, where Russia can fill that void. So in Iran in particular, the sanctions regimes for quite some time really hurt Iran's production capacity in the oil industry, and Russia was very, very happy to step into the breach there. And it was a really strong point of building that relationship between Russia and Iran. Again, some of the unintended consequences of sanctions regime has really forced Russia and Iran into each other's arms, and then their greater dependency also on China, who helps both of them circumvent that, and North Korea. So Turkey's alliance with Russia has also been very interesting during this period too, in that really there's been a need to come to some sort of accommodations in relation to all of their conflicting at times and sometimes aligning interests in a place like Syria. So Turkey's interests there have been related to repressing and fighting the Kurdish zone that's been pretty much operating autonomously, and Turkey has its own forces in Syria. I never hear the UN talking about that. They occupy about 5,000 square miles or square kilometers of Syria, but no one ever tells them that they should be withdrawing or that their military forces should withdraw. But it is a malign influence in many cases in terms of what they are doing to the Kurdish population in the north of Syria. So there was a need there for Turkey, Iran, and Russia to form a basis of interest where they wouldn't conflict with each other. Russia mainly to preserve Hamamin and their port facilities there in Syria, and the Hamamin air base. At the same time, Iran interested in propping up the Assad regime and having a route of supply to Hezbollah, and so they could funnel their rocket missile technologies, etc., and then have a very good link to Lebanon to maintain their influence and disruption in Lebanon as a whole, undermine Lebanese sovereignty. So all these dynamics are going on in somewhere like Syria, where there was a need for them to collaborate and cooperate. So to take it back a step, Russia provided military assistance to Syria, to Assad, at a really critical time in 2015. I remember well when we were sitting there in Parliament House with the government and the opposition, talking about how we were going to manage the day after the elimination of the Assad regime, because there was a point where we knew that within 2 weeks there was going to be a military coup and Assad would be removed. But obviously the Russians had the same intelligence and intervened to prevent that from happening in a very full-throated way, with a lot of force being introduced. So the Ukraine situation that was evolving in 2014 and through that period for Russia, and the conflict with Israel for Iran later on, of course, during this current war and during the current war with Ukraine, prevented the Assad regime from being saved a second time. And Russia also provided, chemical weapons extensively to Syria back in the day when they were able to save him, and they were deployed against their population to a very devastating extent. And Russia, with its position in the Security Council, was able to block any action being taken to prevent and eliminate the chemical weapons threat that had emerged in Syria and still to this day exists there in stockpiles, which need to be dramatically neutralized, and which Israel actually stepped forward to do in the absence of anybody else doing it. But that chemical weapon usage also has been extended by Russia into Sudan as well now. So that alliance between Russia and Syria enabled Iran to concentrate on Hezbollah and its broader operations in the Middle East. And the support for Syria had enhanced the strategic presence generally in the region, influencing a lot of geopolitical dynamics. And most of the fighting in Syria at the time of rescuing Assad in 2015 was actually done by the Wagner group, as it was then. And we had over 63,000 Russians served in that fighting. And so at that time, this is what that looked like. 63,000 personnel, and you can see the large numbers of civilian casualties that were caused during that time in operations that were conducted. So it was a no-holds-barred effort to preserve the Assad regime. Their ability to do that now has been greatly diminished. So then you see also China entering this triangular relationship in that specific vicinity. China's interests coincided in relation to the energy security dimension to all of this. So Russia and Iran shared particular common interests that we've surfaced in the Middle East specifically. Where China comes into this equation is basically because they wanted to actually provide another arm of energy supply. So they've invested heavily. There's a massive $400 billion contract that China's entered into with Iran. And 90% of Iran's oil gets purchased by China. So that's very important to Iran. And so Gazprom is really critical to those issues in Iran, but also in Iraq. The oil industry there depends heavily on Gazprom's capability to exploit it as well, and to develop those oil projects and restore the industry that was so damaged during the Oil for Food program and also the wars that took place in Iraq. So the Iranian support now that has been offered to Russia as a result of this mutual self-interest and support has been really significant. In the early phases of the Ukraine war, a lot of the drone capacity that Russia deployed came from Iran, and we'll talk more about that. But in relation to this evolving Russia-Turkey relations, as things have rolled forward now in Syria, it's really being influenced by specifically the issue in Libya and the issue in Syria of having to find ways to find some consensus about a political construct that preserves everybody's interests. So, Iran and Russia have very great concerns over Turkey's membership of NATO, and Iran over Turkey's secular constitution. And Russia is kind of helping to fuel some of that in its concerns over NATO's positioning there and trying to engage with and de-link Turkey from that NATO involvement. So there's sort of broader strategic games at play here. When we talk about the impact of Russian involvement, it's obviously been to seriously undermine democratic progress in Africa, choking off democratic possibilities in the Middle East, in the cradle, and destabilize the region in general terms. I mean, what they may do in the short term is provide a sort of an instant stability because you've ended up with a dictator and very strict security regimes and military control. But in the long term, it leads to greater destabilization. So it's a bit of a false image that's projected initially, and it would be wrong to say, oh, well, we need Russia to really exert more control in Syria in order to bring the situation into a stable circumstance where we can actually prevent Islamist extremism from getting a stronghold. We should not default to Russia in that respect. There should be greater involvement from the free world to try and resolve those situations in Syria. Economic impacts have become quite significant as well because of Russia's now really close involvement and interest in the energy sector. We've seen how Europe found themselves at the mercy of Russian energy supplies, following on from the original theory from people like Angela Merkel, that you tie them closer to you, there'll be less likelihood of war. Well, that's been shown to have been a false assumption and hope. And certainly, there's a lot of disruption and pressure that Russia buys by being closely involved with oil supplies and the supply routes of the Middle East of oil, and what impact that can have potentially on the global economy. And we've seen that played out many times in relation to the oil boycotts of 1973, the impact of the Iranian Revolution in 78, and other times when it's been used as a political threat. And one of the reasons that drove the US seeking to wean itself off from oil from the Middle East. Of course, also, it really presents a big challenge for the international community and how we engage with these new regimes and dictatorships and military juntas that have been facilitated, created, or supported by Russia. And of course, Russian agendas will be prioritized in the way those countries and governments engage with the West. So it really means Africa is a massive challenge now, in particular for the West. The information warfare is demonizing the West. It's saying that, you'll get no better situation coming to you out of democratizing or having a relationship with the West. They're having their own troubles. They're in economic crisis. They have race divides that are insurmountable and probably lead to race wars. They're degenerate. They'll take your kids from straight couples and give them to gays, etc. These are they get a lot of mileage out of portraying the West as the old colonial club who still think you're second class and still want to dominate you, and what you need is a multipolar world. So all of this means it's very hard to get traction in a lot of Africa now for the West, and to put them in paths that are healthier and would contribute to global stability and security, and not become, homes for terrorism, etc. So, what we've seen from the US and EU is, it's really started out with the sanctions regimes that have been applied to both Russia and Iran, which hasn't really achieved the consequences that we would have hoped because of the way they mutually support each other. And then, you've seen diplomatic efforts to strengthen ties with African and Middle East nations against Russian influence, but that is really resulting in quite futile outcomes in many locations. But it is very important that Europe and the US do maintain that effort and find ways to find interests particularly of those governments in Africa that are still not dominated and purely under that Russian umbrella or subject to even Chinese influence, which has been increasing through development of infrastructure in a lot of those countries. So, there's a good study being done on this problem in Africa by Tariq Magarisi in March this year. And his suggestion is if the US and European governments had better policed the arms embargo, then Russia wouldn't have been able to develop a foothold in Libya, and nor could it have benefited from its Libyan scoping exercise to build relationships with vital partners of the West, such as the UAE. And when Tariq's talking about the arms embargo there, they're talking about the arms embargo against Libya. So that was systematically ignored and breached by Russia, and which was a prime vehicle for it building its influence in its chosen and backed puppets. So, global and diplomatic economic sanctions will only work if they're coordinated very effectively and if they hit people where they really hurt and can't be circumvented. So really, we need accountability mechanisms for attempts to breach that, and a much more effective regime of penalising companies, banking systems, all those who help facilitate all this, and being able to track and trace all of this much more effectively. And we need to bring the new forms of technology and AI to bear to try and really unpick and unravel all of that financial means of controlling the sanctions-busting effort and the benefits from it. Of course, we look then at the African Union and the Arab League reactions to all of this, and they've really not been unified in their response to Russian involvement. And so you have the problem with trying to get unity of perspective on all this, and that just doesn't really exist at the moment. That division prevents really a unified African Union and Arab League response. So, in fact, some of them are really actively looking to get further in bed with Russia for the benefits that can be obtained from that financially, when they have these kleptocratic instincts or tendencies. So everybody else kind of looks over their shoulder and worries about, what might happen to them if they really directly confront this rectangle of ratbags, if you like, and particularly Russia. So, wrapping this all up, the developments and ongoing conflicts that we're seeing is really important to understand some of these dynamics that are behind this, and manipulations and economic interests that are behind a lot of this. And, Russia's role and actions in the global stage will continue to follow this same pattern of behavior, the same linkage between information operations, sanctions busting, financial interests, political interference, and the various leverages that they look to gain to build their influence. All of this pattern of behavior will continue. So we must have a united effort in the free world to track, monitor, and really tackle and neutralize these things. And it begins, of course, with that information warfare effort. So potentially in the future, what we're going to see is a continuing expansion of Russian influence in Eastern Europe and beyond. Hopefully what we might see, if we prevent this situation through presenting a united front and drawing red lines on maps and then putting skin in the game so that Putin is discredited and is defeated on the battlefield and loses any credibility for the key themes of strongman that he pursues even in his own country of Russia, where he wins support through presenting that strongman approach. Perhaps then there may be an internal solution of regime change applied to the current Russian circumstance, and we maybe then be able to engage more actively and constructively to steer Russia down a better path. We're seeing now the impact more broadly of what's going on in Africa and the Middle East affecting global power relationships more deeply. And of course, the US is looking to be at the moment the missing partner in that effort to confront all of this. President Donald Trump seems of the opposite inclination, not to confront and present red lines to Russia, but to actually in some ways encourage them, but certainly not to confront them, to continue to paint them as a potentially willing partner in promoting peace and to being someone in the form of Vladimir Putin that you can deal with rationally. So the challenge for the rest of the world the free world, is to find ways to build coalitions of the willing that will deal with the situation where you may not have the US in your corner in that respect. And so coalitions of the willing will need to be actively worked at. And for Australia, that means actually coordinating more closely with Europe, but also particularly in our region to get more active in presenting united front there and finding ways to support and promote interests for countries in the region that have not been subsumed or suborned by these global powers and their dynamics. So to sum that all up, it's a real worry. It's continuing. It's happening right now. Lives are being lost on a massive scale, and the progress of democracy has been completely reversed. This is a challenging world that we're living in. And the world economy, is still there to be used against what is going on with the strength that the free world still has economically. And we have to find ways to make that work and ways to hold accountable and neutralize attempts to undermine or exploit the economic global regimes. And that will certainly significantly weaken these autocrats. They're all vulnerable to some of that, and particularly dependencies on trade in relation to China. So understanding Russia's role in Africa and the Middle East, though, is really critical for comprehending the shifts in all of these global alliances and dynamics. So we'll finish there, but thanks very much. It's a really challenging and dark sort of story when it comes to Russia in the Middle East and Africa, but we can't move forward unless we understand what the problem is. So we'll say goodbye for now and look forward to seeing you next week. Cheers.